folks, and welcome back to the Podcast Digest. Very happy you guys could join me again for another installment where I recommend to you the greatest shows that I think you guys should be listening to, and I talk to the hosts about the work that they do. The last few weeks have been great here on the Podcast Digest, and I hope you've enjoyed what you've heard. If you have, please, a rating or review in iTunes or Stitcher would be greatly appreciated. For this week's show, I've got a very special guest that I've actually been listening to for a number of years, at least in one of his previous enterprises. His name is Scott Willsey, and he had a show running in excess of 160 episodes up to last year called the PocketSized Podcast. Scott had been focusing on iOS devices and apps and things of that nature, and as an Apple fan, as you guys all well know, it was one of my stable podcast subscriptions. It has since been retired, and I've reached out to Scott to sort of talk about that and what the story was there, and also to get an idea of what he's doing nowadays. And so it's very happy to welcome Scott Willsey to the Podcast Digest. Scott, how you doing?
Hi, Dan. Great. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. It's a real pleasure because, as I mentioned, I was listening to the PocketSized Podcast for a very long time and very much enjoyed the work that you guys did. But before we get into the details there, for anyone who's not familiar with you or the work you've done in the past, tell the folks a little bit about yourself.
Okay. Yeah, I imagine probably most of you are not familiar with me. I'm just a guy who started podcasting back in 2005, actually, and I've done a lot of different podcasts on and off, and it's just something that I've always done for fun and never had any serious ambitions about. But yeah, the podcast that you listen to, PocketSized Podcast, I hadn't been podcasting for quite a while. And I did an episode or two with some of the guys from MyMac, I think. I don't remember if it might have been the MyMac podcast. It might have been one of the others. But anyway, the guys from MyMac.com. And I know you're familiar with that somewhat because you had Tim Robertson on a few episodes ago.
Yes.
And that was fun. And so I started wanting to podcast again. And so that's when I started PocketSized Podcast. And so if anybody here has heard of me, that's probably the one that they've heard of me from. But yeah, I've just been podcasting for a long time. It's fun. I've tried different things and basically just had a lot of fun with it.
You said that you started in 2005. That had to be right back at the very beginning. What was your first show and what was the process like back then of producing a podcast?
Let's see. I'm trying to remember what the first show was. I had one that I called Dual Boot Radio, and it was these early shows were kind of weird, but the concept of that was another friend and I were messing around with both Windows and Linux at the time, and so the premise was we were going to talk about that. I honestly don't remember what we talked about. It may have had nothing to do with that, but we did that for a short time until he flaked out on me, which I'll just say he flaked out on me. He's still my friend, but he did flake out on me. And then I started one called Mac New, which basically was, I was getting back into the Mac again, and so I thought I'll start a podcast for people who are new to the Mac, because that was right about the time. I actually got a Mac Mini the year before Apple went to Intel processors. So, gosh, when would that have been? I think they went back in 2006 or late 2005, and I think I got my Mac Mini in 2005, and so that's when I started that podcast. And that one was just for fun. Again, it was just I'll just have fun and throw it out there and see what happens type of thing. I also, somewhere in there, did a podcast with my dad called Audio Gaijin, which only went 14 episodes, but it was very popular at the time. Got a lot of listener feedback and response and interaction. It was fun. And that one was about the fact that our family lived in Japan when I was a kid. We lived there for a total of 8 years, and it was about our experiences being gaijin in Japan, in a part of Japan and in a time when there were not a lot of foreigners. Now, you can't throw a donburi without hitting a foreigner running around Japan, but at the time it was different. So we did that one. That was fun, and it was mixed in there somewhere with Mac New. I'm not sure of the timing. And yeah, just a lot of hobbies. I used, let's see, at the time, what did I use to record? Oh, I think, so at the time, I don't know if you remember this, but there was a Mac application called Ubercaster. And it basically was a pretty cool premise. It would do everything in one. It would record both tracks and it would split them out. it would you could put your notes in there. You could put audio segments that you could queue up and play at the exact time that you wanted them. It would hijack the audio from Skype or whatever. I mean, it was a very cool app. Unfortunately, it began to have some problems. Maybe Leopard finally killed it, I think. But yeah, I would do that. And I used Libsyn for some of my early podcasts. And so honestly, the production wasn't that much different than today. I'm using different apps, and I try to do double enders and have everybody record their stuff and then, do that. Those types of things are different, but really it wasn't that much different.
When you mentioned the one that you did with your dad, and you said that the response was so good about, the living in Japan concept, so why did it only last 14 episodes?
Well, that was just a matter of, first of all, we only had so much we thought we could say.
Right.
And then, I mean, that's definitely a podcast that has an end, because we did live there for 8 years, but it would be hard to recount it in such fascinating detail that we would take 8 years to relive it. And, we were only there for a finite time, and we kind of were reaching a natural conclusion anyway. And then both of us got really busy in our personal lives. And so we didn't end it as we would have wanted to. We just stopped. But, that was why, though. It's just because we both got busy and it was time to focus on other things for a little while.
Well, even through starting in 2005, and you are still actively podcasting, and we're going to talk about your current show here in just a little bit, but it's clear with, basically a 10-year tail on and off at this point that there's something about the medium that appeals to you or you're fascinated with. If you could put your finger on a couple of things, what appeals to you so much about podcasting, Scott?
I think it's just the fact that anybody can do it, and you can learn from it. You can learn, first of all, there's the technical side, which, to be honest, isn't really that difficult at all. But it is a learning process. You got to learn how to do it. The thing that I like about it is that anybody can get out there and tell a story and have a conversation. And it's just fun to do. I enjoy the conversations that I've had with other people. The one with my dad, Audio Gaijin, it was just a blast to relive those memories with him. And now I have those recordings that someday my daughter can listen to. Other conversations that I've had with people, like in PocketSized Podcast, where I've interviewed some very cool people that I never would have gotten to talk to otherwise. It's just a lot of fun. A lot of fun conversations. It's just having fun. And the bonus is, if I put it out there and other people benefit from it too, that's great. When I get feedback from people telling me that they enjoy the podcast, that's great. I'm very happy. And I do try, it might not be obvious in some of the work that I've done, but I actually do try to have a decent production value and get good sound. And yeah, I've had variable sound quality over the years and all that. But, I take that part of it seriously in the fact that people are taking time to listen. It should be decent, but it really is just about the fun and enjoyment. And, the few times that I've kind of forgotten that or whatever and done some... tried to take it a little more seriously, it just became less fun. The most important part of it for me is having fun and do something that you're enjoying, because your listeners are going to know. If you start mailing it in, it becomes apparent right away.
And I agree with you, and definitely in terms of the benefits of the podcast, you talk about the reference for the future for the family. That's a big deal for sure. And the ability to talk to folks that you probably otherwise wouldn't have in, your non-podcasting life. In my short, experience so far here with the Podcast Digest, I fully agree with all those sentiments and share those as high points in the experience as well. So I fully agree with your perspective there. So we've talked about by and large the road up to PocketSized Podcast, which was the way I was first introduced to you and your work, and as you mentioned, was probably your longest tenured show, if you will, over 160 episodes. For folks who hadn't caught that or haven't gone back and heard that yet, give them the basic premise of the show. Tell them what the show is about.
Well, at the time I started it, I really was in love with my iPhone. And then later, at some point along the way, I got an iPad as well. And I've always liked Apple products. And I started off with Apple when my brother, basically when we lived in Japan, he built an Apple IIe clone, or an Apple II clone. And we played on that all the time. And I learned how to type when he would give me magazines and say, all right, type these games in. And if I typed in so many programs, I could play some games too. That was the deal. And so I've always liked Apple. And then I went away from using Apple products for a while due to my job for a few years. And when I got the Mac Mini in 2005, I think it was, I started getting back into it. I said, I'll just buy this and see what I think of OS X and go from there. And then it wasn't more than a few months before I was completely switched back over to the Mac. And my first iPhone was an iPhone 3GS. And I started playing with that, and I thought, this is something that I really enjoy right now. I also kind of have the itch to start podcasting again. These are two natural things that I want to combine. I knew for sure that I did not want to do a podcast that was technology news. I didn't want to be topical. I didn't want to try to do that game. And I have opinions about that kind of stuff, which you may or may not want to hear. But so what I wanted to do was do something about the experience of using the device itself. And the beauty of using the device itself is all these wonderful apps that we have. And on iOS, I think we're blessed with developers who take it personally. They love it. They're writing apps for that platform because they want to be there. And so we benefit because we get really great apps. And that's kind of the thing that I wanted to talk about more than anything was the devices themselves, the iOS operating system and the apps and accessories and then of course the people involved in those things. That's where I wanted to go with it.
And so you launched this show, and sort of what was the design or the idea? Did you have ideas about frequency, about length, about co-hosts? Or were these sort of evolving as time went on?
Yeah, they definitely evolved. When I started, I wanted it to be somewhat short. That's why it was named Pocket-Sized Podcast. The idea was it would be short, and I thought half an hour. Well, it turns out that, short podcasts are good. And there are people who can be very concise, and they can say what they mean very quickly and get the point across. I don't think I'm one of those people. And so what happened was I certainly started finding out that half an hour was never going to happen. You can't really develop a topic in half an hour sometimes, depending on the topic, depending on the people. Let's assume that it's me because it was. I couldn't develop a topic in half an hour and end it there. So I started going longer. Now, at first I was only going to do bi-weekly, and that's what I was doing. And then it went to be weekly because I realized, for some reason at some point I felt people aren't going to want to pay attention as much unless this thing comes weekly because for whatever reason that's what people want. I don't know if I was right or wrong. Who knows? At some point the listenership did start going up, but it was well after I went weekly anyway, so I don't know if that was a factor or not. I guess if I was going to segue here for a minute, not segue, but take a quick aside. If you're a podcaster and you're worried about that, I think don't. Worry more about your content. Worry more about the length of the individual podcast and worry more about whether or not you're having fun and whether or not you're, don't scramble to produce something every week if you can't do a good show every week. But if you can do a great one bi-weekly, do that instead. But yeah, so anyway, at some point I did go weekly. And it was kind of changing because I did not want to do a podcast by myself. I have listened to episodes of podcasts that I have done solo, and I really wish I could just delete the internet when I hear them. They're horrible. So I can't do monologues. I'm terrible at it. But I do have fun with co-hosts, and so I wanted to get my friend Peter Nicolaitis involved. And part of it was just figuring out how often we could podcast together. He runs his own business, and so he has times where he's got hours per day to podcast with me, and then he has other times where he can't podcast for weeks at a time. And I kind of knew that, but we thought we could make it work, so we started off doing that. And he was on there quite a bit, but there were a lot of episodes that he missed as well. And so that was part of trying to evolve the show, was just figuring out how it was going to work from I have a life and a job, he has a life and a job. We want to do this. We want to take it seriously, but we can't take it too seriously because it's not paying our bills, and it's probably never going to, So like probably every other podcaster out there, just trying to figure out what the right balance is.
And that balance obviously was an ongoing question for you guys. But as you guys started to evolve and change with the format, you had a number of different things that I thought were very unique to your show and your genre, for the time, if you will. You had a lot of different segments. You brought on, you mentioned Peter, but you also had other, I know the names will escape me at this point. It's been a little bit, but you had John Nemo would do a segment, and then there was Rose.
Oh yeah, Suze Gilbert. She would do app reviews, and she liked to do photography apps.
There you go.
She would do that. That was a lot of fun. Yeah.
So what was the thought process behind bringing in these other voices and these other segments? What was sort of the goal, and how were those received in the end, in your opinion?
Well, they were people. John Nemo is the editor at mymac.com. So at mymac.com, what they do is they do a lot of reviews. They do some opinion pieces. They don't do tech news, which, again, yay, because who needs that? I think the world has enough of that. So, but anyway, I met John Nemo through them, and Nemo's a character. He's funny, but he's a great guy, and I think he was doing a bit for a podcast at a time, but he kind of wanted someplace to put his World's Shortest Review Cast, and so we talked about it, and we decided, okay, let's put it in PocketSized Podcast. I don't remember exactly how it came about, but anyway, we talked to each other and agreed to do it, and so that's how he got involved. And then Suze Gilbert also, I got to know through my Mac as well. And I don't know if she still writes for them or not, but she's on the podcast Three Geeky Ladies, which is from my Mac. I think they're calling it Stoplight Network now.
Yes.
Still. And she's on that podcast. But anyway, she was just reviewing photography apps for me. She's always been into photography. She really likes the photography aspect of iOS devices and the different apps that you can play with. That caught her attention right away. And so it's, she's a great person and she's a good reviewer. So I said, hey, go for it. And so I started putting her stuff in there too. And it was just to give a different balance to the show, because what I wanted was, I just did not want it to be me and one other person droning on for the entire time, because I felt like that was every other tech podcast out there. I also felt like it'd be nice to get some unique views. And the whole point of the podcast was to expose people to apps and things that they might not be aware of, or they might be aware of, but they might not know, I need to know more about this before I buy. That was the whole point of it. So I thought, you know what? I can get people to help me do that. It did add to the problem of the length of the podcast, though, because then what it meant was now I had even less time for me and my co-host to talk about whatever we were going to talk about. And so that's when podcast length started creeping up. And I always tried to keep it an hour or less, which wasn't really pocket-sized anymore, but whatever.
Big pockets. Big cargo pockets.
iPad-sized pockets, yeah. So anyway, that was one of the balancing act stresses that I started to have, and I don't mean stresses in a bad way. It was just one of those things I had to figure out. And so, it made for a different dynamic. And I don't know how well it was received. I think a lot of people liked them. Of course, whenever I got feedback from people that didn't like them, I didn't know what to do with it, because it's like, well, I'm not going to change it, and so I guess you're not going to like that part. Feel free to skip it. And I really think a lot of that was because I don't know if you've ever heard of Pragmatic with John Chidgey.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, he just ended that podcast. It ran for a long time, and it was a great technical podcast. And what I mean by technical is he would dive into all kinds of different subjects with a technical mind to it. He would apply an engineer's rigor to the topic. Brilliant podcast, very well done. But one of the things that he said was, people always ask for something different, and then they get mad when you give it to them. And he was exactly right. People ask for something different, but then when you give it to them, then they get irritated. And I think some of the complaints about the extra segments were just because they just wanted two guys talking for an entire, I don't know, maybe it's easier to put in the background that way, I don't know, but you come to realize when there's 1,000,000,001 tech news shows that all sound the same except for the hosts' voices, you realize that people do like their entertainment to be the same. At some point you realize that. And so I think part of the complaints were just that. I don't know. But I'm stubborn and I wasn't going to change it.
Was the occasional or when it happened negative feedback something that would weigh on you? Was there a I don't know, almost like a personal element to it. I guess I'm asking, how much did those type of feedback bother you?
At first, it bothered me more than it should. And here's a tip for people who want to get into podcasting. Don't be like I was when I first got a few pieces of feedback that I didn't like. Don't be defensive about it. It's just somebody's opinion, and everybody has a different opinion, and they have a perfect right to have that opinion. You don't have to defend yourself. You don't have to get irritated and then try and explain. You don't have to podsplain to them why you're doing what you're doing. You just either keep doing what you're doing or listen to their feedback and see, is it good? And if it's good, maybe I should make some changes. But yeah, I should have received some of the criticism I got better than I did. And part of it's just me, but part of it is, as time went on, I did receive it better, and either I wanted to listen to it or I just ignored it, one or the other. But no, I don't think it was a big deal. It certainly had no impact on the podcast continuing or not. It wasn't really something that bothered me.
Well, before we get into that, and that is something I do want to talk about in terms of the retirement of the show, and for lack of a better term, I'll use that one, the retirement of the show. Before we get there, during its height and during when things were going, in your opinion, the best, what were some of the best benefits to come from the show, from the experience of making it, maybe from the listener interaction? What were some of the high points of your experience across these 163 episodes? Yeah,
one of the things I really liked was... there were a couple things that came out of it that were benefits for me personally. Well, I'll say three. This is like a Monty Python skit. Two main surprises. First thing was getting to play with a bunch of different apps and just playing with the apps and seeing what they could do and getting ready to either do a review of them or just a short segment on them. Most of my reviews on that podcast were not that in depth, but they were just a kind of a taste of what the apps were. So that was a lot of fun because, hey, it was an excuse to get apps. And every now and then I would I was kind of lazy about it. I'm not a guy that was just hammering people over the head wanting freebies all the time, but occasionally I'd get freebies from people and I could talk about them on the podcast, and it was great. The other one, of course, was just having fun talking with my co-host because I just enjoyed that. That goes back to just having fun podcasting with somebody and having conversations. The one that you mentioned, though, the interaction, the response, the listener feedback and all that, man, that podcast had some of the best listeners I've ever had on any podcast, and probably that anybody's ever had on any podcast. Just some great, great people. Very lucky. One of the things that I remember the most fondly and still try to keep in touch with is the people. And just great feedback, great smart people that would contact us with great ideas, great thoughts, great insight, great input. And yeah, it was a community. It was fun. And that was one thing that I didn't really anticipate happening in the way that it did, because most podcasts, I think, could probably, aside from the gigantic podcasts, the one thing I've heard from podcasters over and over again is nobody ever contacts me. Nobody ever gives me feedback. I never hear from anybody. I don't even know if anybody, and that's the way it was in the beginning, but it very quickly became not that way. And that was a lot of fun. I met some really good people through PocketSized Podcast, and that was cool.
Yeah, I remember you guys had and I was a part of it. Heck, maybe if I look, I still am, a very active Google Plus community, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, Google Plus, not good for a lot of things, in my opinion, but it is great for being able to set up a community or a group. I can't even remember what they're called now, but you can basically set up a page where you can have conversations with people related to a topic. And so I did. I set up a PocketSized Podcast group, and we would have some really great discussions there. It's still open. I don't participate in it anymore just because I don't. It's kind of like the podcast ended. I did stay active there for a little while after the podcast ended, and I occasionally get people requesting to join, which I have it set up where I have to be notified, but yeah, I've just been ignoring those two. But while the podcast lasted and while we were doing it, that was a lot of fun. That was great because we did get a lot of feedback there, and it was a place where everybody could see what was going on and see what the conversations were.
Yeah, and I looked, and they are communities, and I am still a member. I just pulled it up.
Yeah, I didn't boot anybody out. I'm not doing that. But
so that was sort of the height, if you will, at its when things were going well. What happened when things started to turn? What was sort of the first signs that this may be seeing its end at some point?
Well, it really had nothing to do with the podcast itself. I think the podcast, from the feedback I have gotten and the feedback of everyone that I've talked to about it, people were happy with it. It could have kept going. It was fine. It wasn't anything to do with the podcast itself. I think what happened was, at that point in time, my co-host was Ronnie, because Peter just wasn't able to do it. And I told him at one point, hey, I'm going to fire you and replace you with someone else. He was like, okay. And so I went looking for a new host, and it worked out great with Ronnie. And so I said, hey, let's do this. And so Ronnie started, and unfortunately, I ended it before I didn't even give the guy 50 episodes, I don't think, which shows how terrible I am. If I would have done the math beforehand, I could have kept it going until he had 50 episodes under his belt, but I didn't. And so, anyway, it was just a matter of, PocketSized Podcast was very specific. It had a core theme. It had a topic that it needed to stick to, and I just didn't want to deviate from it. Many, many, many times, topics or ideas were suggested to me, or even reviews were brought to me. And, if you went and asked all the people who participated in that podcast, you could be assured that they would tell you that I said no many times. I just said no. That sounds great. It's not for this podcast. I'm just not doing it. I'm not stepping there, because that's not what this podcast is about. And so, I was not going to do it I wasn't going to ruin it by opening it up and just making it be, not having a focus. I wanted to keep the focus right. But it got to the point where, it was just a lot of preparation every time, because we had to have a new topic. We had to get time to play with apps or the features of the OS, whatever it was we were going to talk about. And I don't know, at some point I just did not want to talk about my iPhone all the time anymore, and my iPad. I just didn't want to do it. They're still a huge part of my life. I still love them, and I love iOS when, I have an Android phone that I have to use at work, and
oh no.
Yeah, I'm sorry to all you Android people out there. It's just not my thing. But I just found that, is this what I want? Do I want to talk about this all the time? Like, do I want this to be the main focus of my podcasting? And at the time I decided, no, I didn't. I was getting burnout. And, as I've mentioned before, you have got to not let yourself get burnout. And if you do, take steps to correct it. Because if you think you're going to continue your podcast and you're starting to feel that way, man, is it ever going to become apparent to the people? You're not doing them any favors. And you're not doing yourself a favor either, because you're not having fun anymore. But you're not doing your listeners a favor, because they're going to hear it. They're going to tell. They're going to figure it out that you're mailing it in. And, they've only got so many hours in the day. Don't do that to them.
You mentioned the topic selection, and then obviously the time spent with the applications you're about to talk about. And then, of course, you've got the recording, and then you've got the editing, and you had some unique things in your editing. I do want to hear, as a side story, the story behind Siri, because that was always a blast to hear those segments. But how much time, on average, would you say the production process was for an episode? How much of your free time was this really consuming?
Well, recording would take an hour to an hour and a half, usually closer to an hour and a half. And then editing would take, I figured it was taking me about twice as long to edit as it was to record. And that's just because some podcasters probably have a good system for not letting certain things get into their podcast, getting rid of collisions real time, getting rid of coughs and all that real time. And I didn't. They were in there, so I had to go get them out. And then I would also edit for content, because, as you've probably noticed from this conversation already, I tend to repeat myself a lot. And so there's nothing worse than saying the same thing over 10 times. Yeah, it may be true, but you only need to tell me once, and I haven't mastered that. But so, yeah, I found it was taking me about 3 hours for the editing, and then just the normal publishing, which takes a few minutes, and doing the show notes and all that. So it would add up. The rest of it, not so long. The Siri thing was interesting. So I was just using the Mac, and I was just using the dictation on the Mac, or the speech. And what voice would I load up? I was loading up Samantha, I think, is the voice of Siri. So if you go into your Mac's system preferences and go to dictation and speech, and you go to text to speech, and you find Samantha, that is Siri. And so then I would just write out in text edit what I wanted to have Siri say, and I would just Audio Hijack Pro that, and that would be Siri.
I always thought it would be more complicated.
Nope. And people always say, how do you get Siri to say that? I'm like, I don't.
That's great.
Yeah. So that kind of stuff, it took a little bit of time, but not that long. That was very minimal, and it was well worth it because it just added a little bit of fun to the podcast, and it was fun for me. And so, that was worth the few minutes of time investment that I put into that kind of thing.
So you've got the work that is encompassed during the course of the week. You've got the concept that this is, a little bit of burnout is happening here, where you didn't want this to be sort of your current podcasting resume, if you will, talking about your iPhone or iPad. But all of that being the case, I imagine it's still yet another leap before show retirement. What was that thought process where you decided, am I actually going to shut this thing down?
Yeah, well, that was a conversation I had with Ronnie, and I was like, I don't know if I want to talk about my iPhone all the time. He was like, you know what? I've been feeling exactly the same way. And he's always wanted to podcast, but Ronnie is a very interesting guy, and he knows a lot about history. He knows a lot. He does a lot of reading. He's interested in many, many, many different things besides tech, which he is into big time, but I think he just wanted to have other things to say too, and we kind of reached that point at the same time, which is kind of weird. But it was those kind of conversations, and maybe I just have a short attention span. Maybe that's why I've never really mastered anything in my life, is I keep cycling between hobbies and going back from one to the other, and part of that's just because that's just life. We only have so many hours in the day, and if you want to do several things, that's how it goes. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe it was just I'd been doing it for a while. I wanted something new. Part of it was just how much more do I have to say about this device? Granted, things keep changing and there are always new apps, but I don't know. At some point, it was hard for me to make it feel, fresh and new all the time. And so it was more of that than anything. It had nothing to do with the podcast itself. I enjoyed the podcast itself. I enjoyed, like I said, the listeners, best group of listeners ever. There was nothing about the podcast itself or how things were going with it or anything like that. It was just, this is the topic. It has to be focused, or it just becomes, I don't know what it becomes. And then, do I want to keep doing it? And Ronnie and I guess, were at the same point at the same time. And so we just decided now is a natural break point. My other problem is, once I make up my mind about something, I can take a while to decide, but once I make up my mind, I just want to get it over with. And that's why once I made up my mind, boom, it came to a halt at 163.
So that was sort of my next question. So you make the decision, you guys record the last episode, you hit publish that last time.
Yeah.
In the following days afterwards, any regrets, any thinking like, oh no, or is it just a sort of sense of freedom and on to the next thing?
Oh, I felt free. I felt wonderful. People kept telling me how sad they were, and I felt like saying, not me. But I was in the sense that, I really appreciated those sentiments, and I was sad in the sense that, I was sharing this with you guys, you were sharing it with me, and now we won't have that shared experience together. That part of it did bother me. I do miss that, and I was sad about that, because like I said, to me, that was a unique experience in podcasting, where not only was I getting a lot of interaction with my listeners, these were people that I came to know. These were, I really started to form friendships with them, and that's kind of unusual, because sometimes even if you do get feedback, it's like once in a while you'll hear from this person, then you'll hear from someone else, but this was way beyond that. So that part of it, yeah, I did feel bad about, but I don't know, man. You got to pick how you want to use your time, and it just didn't. Did it make me say, "Oh no, I did the wrong thing"? No, definitely not.
One more question on PocketSized, Scott, and then I want to talk about your current podcast. But you mentioned before that you felt that PocketSized Podcast had its niche focus and it needed to be there. But for other podcasters that may find themselves at the end of a run in a niche down type show topic, did you have any thoughts or give any consideration to the concept of a reboot, rebrand, restructure, reformat, where maybe you sort of expanded a little bit beyond the niche? And if so, what led you to go the direction you did instead of that?
Yeah. Well, Boy, you're talking about stuff that happened a long time ago. I have a small daughter, and I can't remember anything that happens past last week.
Right.
I think.
Well, I guess what I'm thinking is that maybe make it a strictly interview show or a panel show or go to monthly or something like that.
I thought about that. In fact, your podcast is a really great example of what I think of as a really good type of podcast that's probably not done enough, and when it is done, it's probably not done very well. So, thank you for what you're doing because
thank you, sir.
I like it.
I appreciate it.
One of the things that I actually do want to do, and I haven't started yet, is I do want to do an interview podcast because that has been one of the things that I've always enjoyed the most. Whenever I get somebody on and it's about them, not just as a co-host or whatever where we're talking about something, but where it's about the person, because I can promise you, whoever I'm interviewing, they are endlessly more fascinating than I am, and they are endlessly more worth hearing about than I am. And it's just a fun process. Like, because, I've listened to your show and I know that you know what you're doing, but it's when somebody knows what they're doing and they're doing an interview and they're just kind of going where the person's leading them and digging stuff out of them, it's great. The listener loves it. The interviewer loves it. The interviewee hopefully loves it. It's a lot of fun. That is one type of podcast that I do want to do, and I actually had made a promise on my website that I'd start in March, and then I keep changing that as the months go on. But but for Pocket-Sized Podcast, I didn't want to change it because I felt like even though there had been changes over time, the essence of the show had not changed, and I felt like I didn't want to suddenly evolve it into something that people hadn't signed up for. I just felt like that wasn't fair. I have no qualms about doing whatever I want with my podcast, and if the listeners happen to like it, great. But if they criticize me, oh well, unless I happen to think that it's good. Unless I happen to think that it's something that you're right, I'm screwing this up and I need to change it. So I don't have a problem with doing different things, but I didn't want to do it to Pocket-Sized Podcast, which had gone as many episodes as it did with a given premise, and then all of a sudden, hey, we're going in a totally new direction. Didn't see that coming, did you? I just didn't want to do that.
That makes sense. That makes complete sense. And I can completely understand why, your desire to try these other things meant sort of the forcible retirement of the previous show. So the show ends. Tell me about, once that show ends and you hit that publish for last time, as I mentioned, what's your journey back behind the microphone look like? How long did you take off? And when you started to think about it again, what was that process like?
Oh, that is a good question. Let's see. We did the last Pocket-Sized Podcast. It was published on August 30th, 2014. One of the tags I put on that episode was "So long and thanks for all the fish." And then Haberdashery, we started in January 5th, 2015. So, man, that was a great break. I enjoyed it. I have to tell you, I enjoyed it. Because typically what would happen is we would record on a day that I had off, and then I would usually get it edited the night before going to work for the first time for the week, but not always. Sometimes I would have to come home that first night and finish editing it. Man, I loved not having that editing process, even though, 3 hours, whatever. It wasn't huge. It was an evening's worth of work. But I really enjoyed having that time off from even thinking about any of that kind of stuff for those months. It was needed. I did not realize how much I needed it until I did it. And I think that's why a lot of podcasters now want to do seasons. And I totally get that. And if it works and their listeners buy into it and they're honest and they actually do come back, which some don't, then that's probably a really good idea. Because it gives you a break. It lets you... People are familiar with the concept of seasons. They watch TV shows, and TV shows will play 6 episodes, and then, hey, it's middle of the season break, and now it's end of the season break, and whatever. They have breaks all the time now, but people know that idea. They're okay with it. So I think that's probably a really good idea. I don't know if I'll ever do that for any of my podcasts, but I can understand the sentiment of what makes people do that. The break was wonderful. Really enjoyed it. But by the time Ronnie and I started recording again together on this completely different podcast, it was fun to talk to him again. It was nice to start recording again. So, yeah, it's like anything in life. Sometimes you need a break. Just get away, and when you come back, it'll probably be more enjoyable than it ever was, assuming it's something that's a habit in your life. If you've been doing it for a while, you know it's something that you actually want to do for some reason. And just take a break. I bicycle a lot. I ride bike rides. I've done centuries and all that. And last year, at the end of the year, I just did not want to touch my bike ever again. I just was like, you know what? I don't want to do this. I'm going to run. And then at some point earlier this year, when I started biking again, I really, really enjoyed it in a way that I hadn't enjoyed it for a while. Same can be true for podcasting. And in my case, it definitely was. I just needed a break. I needed a reset. I needed to be told, okay, it's okay. You can do something different now. You can think differently about this and take a break and don't edit stuff and spend that time with your daughter or whatever. And then when it comes time to get back into it, it's fun again.
So you mentioned Ronnie is also your co-host on your new show. For anyone that didn't catch it, it's called Haberdashery at habdab.com. So was the concept when you guys retired PocketSized Podcast that you would take a break of X amount of time and then come back with, sort of a different focus? Was that sort of intended from the beginning, or did it just sort of happen naturally after the break?
No, we intended to, because we had been talking and we both agreed before we ended PocketSized Podcast, Ronnie, Ronnie gave me too much credit or felt beholden to me more than he should, I think, where he said, you know what, I don't want to podcast without you. He appreciated the fact that he got to come on as a co-host. I don't think he needs to feel that way. I think Ronnie should do whatever he wants to, because he's just a great guy. And, he's got to be far more popular than me as a host, But we wanted to podcast together again. We wanted to keep having conversations together. It's just we kind of both felt at the time we want to talk about other stuff too. And, he's got a lot of interests. I have other interests. The thing is, so what we wanted to do is we started Haberdashery with the idea of we will have topics. We're not just going to get on the mic and start babbling about whatever happened for the week and make some stupid jokes and hang up. We wanted a topic each episode. What we didn't want was we didn't want it to have to stick to a particular genre or, field of interest. Like, we have talked about food, we have talked about games, we have talked about OCD, we have talked about, all kinds of stuff. The question, which needs yet to be answered, is can we keep doing this and have it be interesting enough to ourselves that it shows? And can we build an audience with this? And will it still be interesting to them? Because one of the dangers of covering lots of different topics is the opposite of what PocketSized Podcast had. You know what you're getting with PocketSized Podcast. You don't always know what you're going to get with Haberdashery. You do know that you're going to get two guys talking about their opinions, and hopefully it'll be a somewhat focused show. But you don't know what the topic's going to be like. You may not care about the restaurants in Portland and Vegas, but you might. Who knows? So it is definitely different, but it was in the plan. Even before we ended PocketSized Podcast.
And as of the moment of this recording, you guys are, is it 10 episodes in?
Yeah, we've only done 10 episodes. We actually started, like I said, we started in January 5th. The idea was to be weekly. We've kind of almost done that, but we've just both been busy lately. Ronnie's work schedule has been crazy. My work is crazy and is going to get crazier, but it's not a we're quitting thing or anything like that. It's just we're recording when we can. In fact, in episode 10, we just said we're going to go bi-weekly because we just we're both just overloaded. But the goal now is to be bi-weekly. I don't think it's going to affect listenership because, to be honest, compared to PocketSized Podcast, nobody's listening to this one. And that's not to denigrate the people that are. I appreciate them, and I'm glad they are. I hope they're having fun. But, it's a tiny, tiny podcast. It's not... maybe it's because most of the people that know us from PocketSized Podcast, and this is definitely not that, and maybe it's not their thing, and that's fine. I have no problem with that. But, right now it doesn't seem to have a real audience.
What are your thoughts on podcast marketing? Because you mentioned the audience size. Obviously, I'm sure you guys would love to recreate, like PocketSized audience or beyond. What are your thoughts on the topic? What are some of the things you like to do, don't like to do, or is this not something that you enjoy doing at all?
Well, I am the wrong guy. Somebody once told me, I remember a friend's mom, it was not long after high school, I think it was early college years, and one of my friend's moms told me, in the middle of a conversation we were having, you just don't know how to make money. And I was really annoyed with her at the time. I was like, what is your problem? But she was actually 100% right. I don't know how to make money. I know how to go to work and get paid. Same with marketing. I don't know how to market stuff. I don't know how people build up big, successful podcasts. For me, PocketSized Podcast happened by accident. And it was great. I loved it. But I don't know how people do that. So from marketing perspective, I do have some ideas. And then Peter Nicolaitis, he actually has to market himself for a living with his company. He has a lot of good ideas too. And they're always much appreciated. Right now, I have done zero effort into trying to grow Haberdashery because of the time constraints. We've literally, that's why we're not weekly right now. We've literally only had time to record, edit, get it out there, tweet about it, and move on with our lives and get back to all the other stuff that's vying for our attention. So, yeah, it's a big failure. I mean, I'm not saying it's a big failure, but no, I don't mean the podcast. I mean my marketing efforts are a big failure.
Gotcha. Okay.
Because they're basically non-existent. And so, yeah, it's, I don't know. I will say this. I've looked at the names of people you've interviewed, and I may be the least known podcaster you've ever talked to, possibly.
Well, I've been fortunate, and basically I'm a prolific emailer. So I don't know that I would put too much stock into my interview of rosters. Part of what I've wanted to do all along is to simply bring attention to those who I think are doing great work. And I'll be honest with you, I've not yet had a chance to listen to Haberdashery. I am subscribed. It is in my queue, but if you've heard me talk about this on previous episodes, my queue is stupid, ridiculous in terms of its size. It is coming up. I should get to it this week, although I am starting back at the beginning. So,
yeah.
But I wanted to talk to you because I was such a huge fan of PocketSized Podcast. I know the work that you've done in the past is excellent. And, if even a couple of more people that have heard any of my previous shows want to come over and check out what you guys are doing, then, I'm glad to help. And, based on the work that you've done in the past that I've been a big fan of, I'm sure many of the folks who do listen to this show will find something that they would enjoy over with your efforts, Scott. So hopefully it will be of help. But before we go, Scott, can you tell people where they can find this new show we've been talking about and any other work you've got out there online?
Yeah, habdab.com, that's habdab.com is where we have Haberdashery. And take a listen. If it's your thing, great. If it's not, that's fine too. By the way, I totally understand, no pressure at all for anybody, including yourself, Dan, to listen, because I hear you with the podcast queue. I'm right there with you. We only have so many hours per day, and you got to pick and choose your battles. You can also find my personal website at saw66.com. And I have a podcast page there. It's got a list of podcasts that I have done. It's not comprehensive. It doesn't go back to my early podcast, but I have Audio Gaijin archive there. I have Not Speeding in Reverse archive there, which I did with Peter. And then I have links to Haberdashery, PocketSized Podcast. And I also talk about a couple podcasts, or maybe just one of them. I have a link to a podcast that I want to start soon, and that's the interview one. And that one I really need to do, because I think it's just something that I need to do. I just want to interview people and do that. It sounds like a lot of fun. I just need to figure out how realistic it is in terms of time, what the frequency is going to be, and then, like yourself, when I've interviewed people in the past, it's a matter of contacting people and figuring things out, and I just haven't had time for that right now, but I'll get it done. And so that's there, and, whatever. That's how you can find me.
Well, from the interviews you guys did on PocketSized Podcast, I'm sorry I keep hesitating. If you remember my previous episode, I interviewed Michael Fisher from Pocket Now, and I keep stumbling over that each time. So I don't want to mix up Pocket Now and PocketSized Podcast, but that's why I keep checking myself there. PocketSized Podcast, I remember in several interviews, I remember you guys talking to founder, programmer, whatever, 1Password.
Right.
I remember that interview and several others that you had conducted over the years. So I think the interview show would be excellent, and always more room in the pool.
Yeah,
love to have you join us.
Yeah, well, I don't think I'll threaten you any, but I do want to say no. I was serious, and I don't want to sound like I'm trying to blow smoke or anything like that. But I was serious when I said I really enjoyed listening to your show, because there are interview shows where people don't know how to interview, and you're definitely a person that does know how to interview. So keep it up, because it's great to listen to.
Well, I appreciate that, Scott. I really do. And folks, if you are looking to try something new in your subscription list, habdab.com from Scott Willsey and Ronnie Lutes is something worth checking out. They're bi-weekly now, so it will not pollute your stream or anything of that nature. Check them out, see if it's for you, and hopefully you will enjoy and listen. And folks, in the meantime, I appreciate you listening to me here, Dan Lizette, on the Podcast Digest. Thank you again, and I will talk to you guys again next week.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.